Welcome to Season 4 of The Great Umbling. My name's Ed Gillespie, and I'm a futurist, a poet, and a recovering sustainability consultant. In the spring of 2020, during the first lockdown, I began recording a series of conversations with Dougald, co-founder of a school called Home. We started with a question. What if it makes sense to think of ourselves as living in a time of humbling, being laid low, brought down to earth? Pulling on that thread has taken us further and become more central to our work than either of us expected. So we're back now with an open-ended series as part of the wider patchwork of homewardbound.org. Thank you for listening.
Well, Ed, here we are, the 6th episode of our 4th series after nearly 2.5 years of recording these conversations. And I always start by saying here we are, but I think for the first time we can really say we are here.
We are actually here in the flesh, in person.
Yeah, sitting by the water at the Mill of Impermanence with the sounds trickling away in the background, the pigeon's nest in the arbour just above us, and the occasional barking of dogs in the distance. Well met, sir.
Yes, I say, hail fellow, well met. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that we've been through this period of time, and I don't think anyone ever believes us or believes me when I say to them, you know, Dougald and I have never actually been in the same physical space as far as we're aware together, and yet we've done dozens of episodes of a podcast together and built a friendship.
Yes, and people have listened to us and followed along with these conversations and had that sense of getting to know us. It's quite strange to step out of the sort of the rectangle of the Zoom window and be here in this edgeless presence with the squeaky bench that I'm sitting on and all of the ordinary materialness of actually being in the same space.
Well, I think it's also the containment of time as well.
Yeah.
So when we've always arranged to talk, there's been a natural bracketing, an hour or two together. And I think, it's that comedy moment we had last night after you and the family arrived. And I said to you, so how long have you got? And having completely forgotten that I'd invited you to stay. It was only when that penny dropped. So, no, they're coming to stay, aren't they, for a couple of days? And so it was the expansiveness of time as well, realising that we weren't just going to be together for an hour or two, we were going to be together for a couple of days.
Because whenever you meet through screens and cameras and so on, you're stepping into this magic box whilst bodily still being where you actually are.
Yeah.
And so sooner or later you need to return to being where you actually are. Whereas we actually are here. And last night we went to the Locks pub, the pub of the long now, that was woven like such a thread through our first series. And it's this sense as well. I mean, nice to meet you, Ed. Also nice to meet these places that I've heard so much about and kind of travelled with the story of. It's really a joy.
And were my descriptions of these places, did they live up to the hype? Now you're experiencing them firsthand from your own perspective. Am I guilty of magical hyperbole? Or have I been going for critical understatement?
I think it's always this thing of translation. So, I mean, I'd seen the photographs of the mill here, and that's kind of the Instagram version of it. And it's a place, it's a building, it's a location that is very Instagram friendly, let's say. And so then you arrive and you're not looking at a flat image taken from a particular angle. You're part of everything that's going on in the place. And so you move from that representation of it into just being part of it. And, all that the Instagram version of it can ever do is sort of sell, I'm going to have to use the word the vibe of what it's actually like to be there. But you can never tell from looking at the picture. We've all had the Airbnb experiences of somewhere where you've got one picture from looking at the photographs and you get another one so you can smell the place.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sort of smelling the honeysuckle and everything else here. No, it lives up to its billing. Lovely. Absolutely, Ed.
And it was interesting in advance of us meeting for the first time as well, because I was in conversation with our mutual friend Sophie Howarth the other week, and she said to me, and I said, Dougald and I are finally going to meet in person. And she just looked at me and she goes, he's very tall. And I had no sense that you might be a man of grand stature. And I half expected you to turn around and we met and going, aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?
Well, people have asked me, were there any surprises? And I said, well, the rumour that he's 6'4" turns out not to be true. The full head tattoo was a bit of a surprise. I'm assuming it's not. It's a tattoo of impermanence.
It's a tattoo of impermanence. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, it's my temporary piratical henna tattoo for my 50th birthday. So I thought, what can I do that is reckless and foolish and quite colourful, but also won't be there forever.
Yeah, wisely done. I think my mum got her first tattoo about when she turned 60.
Brilliant.
Yeah, she said if I got it when I was 21, I might have regretted it, but I don't think I'm going to live to regret it now. Wow, what are we going to talk about?
Well, I'd like to talk about the reason that brought us here.
Yeah.
The very fact that, I was celebrating my birthday and we were bringing this sort of gathering of the clans and the strange synchronicity that you happen to be in the UK at the same time, completely by happenstance, and to be close enough to attend and join in. And I think there was something powerful about the bringing together of a large number of folk from the last sort of 20 or 30 years of my life, many of whom knew of each other, but perhaps who hadn't actually met physically in person before, but by name and reputation and by work were quite familiar to one another. And there was also that sort of slight exuberance on Saturday, wasn't there? The sort of crazy energy.
I think exuberance is the right word. Yes, yes.
I mean, if you're going to have a party,
your neighbours might have other words for it.
Yeah, if you're going to have a party where the theme is still pirates, which was a hat tip to our good friend Sam Conniff, in terms of being more piratical. But no, I think there was something wonderful about that alignment of folk and people getting to meet for the first time, often in the flesh, and in particular that idea that when you gather folk like that, it's often about those creative collisions, and I think we were all letting off a bit of steam because we haven't had big parties like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of your guests did say to me, "It's the party of the decade." And I said, yeah, I mean, to be fair, there hasn't been much competition so far in the 2020s. But
very low bar, very low bar.
But it definitely felt like people were making up for lost time. I mean, for me and Anna, it wasn't just that you and I were meeting in person for the first time. We had two other people who feel like we've really got to know each other pretty deeply because they've been part of the Homeward Bound series and the Long Table community that we host, but we'd only ever met through Zoom windows. So it was lovely to meet Andy Jukes and his wife Jo, and to meet David Bent for the first time, and and then simultaneously these people kept popping up who I knew years ago in the London era of my life. Bryony Greenhill, whose singing was one of the magical moments of the occasion. So yeah, no, it was a hard act to follow. Like,
When's your 50th? You've got a few years
I've
yet.
got a few years yet. Yes, I've got about 5 years to go. So yeah, well, we'll have to get you to Sweden for that.
Plenty of planning time.
Plenty of planning time. Yes, yeah. We'll be a few stages further on in the conversion of the Red House as well. So we'll have the capacity for it. But I suppose I have to tell the story of how we even ended up at your 50th birthday party, because it's a long way to come from Sweden.
I mean, I was deeply touched, but I know it wasn't necessarily the primary reason you were in the UK.
well, so it's 3 years since we've been over as a family for obvious reasons, and we had my dad's sort of 70th birthday celebrations had been delayed by the pandemic, and we'd had this idea that we wanted to find somewhere that was kind of a classic English seaside holiday. And so I'd gone ahead and been sort of looking around, and in fact found this place called the Hotel of Wizardry in Great Yarmouth, which is a Harry Potter themed bed and breakfast. And
what first drew you to the Hotel of Wizardry?
It may possibly be the things that I read with our 6-year-old son, and the sense of here was a place that would work for him and for his grandparents, and we could have a lovely few days together. So I booked this, and then I went, "Oh, Ed, you live a bit near Great Yarmouth, don't you? We'll have to come and see you." And then you said, "Yeah, when are you coming?" And I said, "Well, just over the end of June, beginning of July." And that's when my 50th birthday is. You have to come to the party. You're like, "Well, great, we've got the grandparents to babysit, so we're sorted." So then, as we set off on the train journey from Sweden, heading via various places en route to the UK, the thought pings in my head, what do you get your fellow podcast host, who you've never actually met in person, for his 50th birthday? And I don't generally get inspiration when it comes to presents. I'm not very good at it, but I had this little thought. A Uriah Heep album. Bear with me. So for those who haven't read their Charles Dickens in a while, Uriah Heep, besides being a 70s prog metal band, is originally the name of a character in David Copperfield, who is a rather unpleasant man whose defining feature is constantly boasting about how humble he is. He's ever so humble.
Greatly humble.
Greatly humble, exactly. So here we are, and 2 days into the trip, we stop off in Brussels for a couple of nights for a reunion with Anna's old friends from when she used to live there, and these are people we hadn't seen in a long time, and there were all these children who weren't there last time we saw each other, and it was brilliant. And on the second day of that, we were due to be meeting up with them to catch the bus together out to the house where we were going to cook dinner, and they sent a message saying, "Come to number 225 Rue Haute." And we got there, and they weren't there, but 225 Rue Haute turned out to be a second-hand record shop. And I stepped in the door, and there's a kind of rock A to Z in a set of crates along the shelf next to the door, and I'm flipping through, going to U for... Yeah, the first 3 things under U are 3 Uriah Heep albums. And Alfie comes over and says, "Daddy, what are you doing?" And to be honest, he's probably not seen very many vinyl records in his life so far. I say, "Well, I've been looking for an album by this band to give to Ed." And then out of nowhere, the proprietor of the shop pops up and says, "Cherchez-vous Uriah Heep?" And then he pulls out another crate that's hidden away underneath and pulls out an album and gives it to me. And it's Uriah Heep's, I want to say, 5th album from 1972, a good vintage.
The year I was born.
The title of it is The Magician's Birthday. I think, all right then, all right. So we pick up The Magician's Birthday, take it with us to the Hotel of Wizardry, from where we are coming to Loddon for your birthday party. And when we arrive at the Hotel of Wizardry, next door to the Hotel of Wizardry is the Copperfield Guest House. And at this point, it's all starting to get a little bit weird. Oh yeah, and you just sent me a message saying that you'd been reading a book by an actual magician that I'd recommended to you on our last episode, and that it had blown your mind. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But the final piece in the jigsaw fell into place the next night when we were sort of out for a walk along the prom in Great Yarmouth and past the Royal Hotel, and a plaque on the side of the wall said, Charles Dickens lived here 1841 to 42 or whatever year it was, while working on his novel David Copperfield. So Great Yarmouth is literally the birthplace of Uriah Heep. And I think we can say the spiritual home of the Great Umbling.
As you said in the last episode we did on belief, there are no coincidences, and that is just layer upon layer upon layer of synchronous joy.
Yeah, it's kind of taking the piss, isn't it? Yeah, I said I don't believe in coincidences, and the universe is like, hold my beer.
Yeah, watch this.
But we actually, with the Long Table, which is our membership community for a school called Home, we had a couple of sessions on Monday hosted from the Hotel of Wizardry, where the first one was on magic, obviously, and the second one was on serendipity and synchronicity, and we had some really interesting conversations about this, because you're the definitions man, Ed, so you can do this, but the word serendipity has an unusually precise origin for a word that's been around for a few centuries, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those, many created words. Shakespeare famously was constantly conjuring new words into being with wonderful meanings. But I first really got into serendipity because my very good neighbour in London and great friend for 20 years was of Sri Lankan origin. So Varuna with Anna, who lived next door to me, we are still neighbours of the heart, even though we no longer live in close proximity. We always used to talk about serendipity because the word was actually conjured into existence by the writer Horace Walpole, based on these legendary stories of the princes of Serendip, which was the old name for Sri Lanka. And Walpole had a very precise definition of it, where he said that these princes would go off on these extraordinary adventures, and incredible things would happen to them. And much like your Uriah Heep and Yarmouth Dickensian journey, and he was saying, these princes were always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things they were not in quest of. And there's something wonderful about that, because perhaps it's the intentional, active act of searching that precludes the wonderful emergent possibilities that might actually be the real reward.
Well, yeah, there's something here that maybe I'm beginning to understand after whatever it is, 4.5 series, why we keep circling around to these questions about serendipity and synchronicity and how it might fit together with some of the heavier stuff that runs through our conversations. I mean, my friend Dan Knaus wrote an amazing piece the other night after the Long Table conversation about this, and one of the things he said was, if you look at that Horace Walpole definition, one of the things that doesn't get commented on is what an interesting combination that is, by accident and sagacity. So some combination of sort of surrender to accidental, unexpected surprise, combined with sagacity, a kind of wisdom. There's a really interesting clue in that. But I mean, the other thing that I remember discovering years ago is that not only is this made-up word, all words were made up at some point, it's just some of them we can more precisely identify when and where they were made up. But so serendipity was made up by Horace Walpole in 1758. Rather more recently, another novelist, actually, William Boyd, said, well, we need an opposite to serendipity. And so he coined the word zemblanity. He said... Zemblanity. It's great, isn't it? He said, what's the opposite of serendip, this southern land of spice and warmth, lush greenery and hummingbirds, sea-washed, sun-basted? Think of another world in the far north, barren, ice-bound, cold, a world of flint and stone. Call it Zembla. Ergo, zemblanity, the opposite of serendipity. the faculty of making unhappy, unlucky, and expected discoveries by design. And it's sort of the definition of, not the good intentions of modernity, but the shadowy underside of what it produces in practice. A world from which serendipity has been exiled by the attempt to control and manage everything and treat the world as if it is or ought to be a machine.
And that's that design piece. It's the chronicle of a tragedy foretold, isn't it? The fact that you get this instrumental outcome as a result.
And I want to say, so in the piece that Dan wrote the other day, he made the case that actually, even these concepts of serendipity and synchronicity and so on are a sort of product of our alienation from the world we actually inhabit. That they're a kind of gentrified amazement at the occasional intrusion of something which is actually what the world is like, which is that it is full of these patterns of relationship. And as I would say, it's what's kind of at stake here is the world just a series of meaningless one thing happening after another? Or is the world, in some sense, without us necessarily being able to explain it or needing a framework to explain it, the kind of place in which there are patterns and in which there are messages, and some of those messages are meant for us? And the story that I sometimes tell that is, to me was kind of a crunch moment for that was, I did a lot of hitchhiking when I was young. I spent a year travelling around Europe when I was 18 or 19, and for most of the next decade, most of the travel I did was by hitchhiking. And so you spend a lot of time surrendering to the kindness of strangers, being in a situation where you have no control. It's the opposite of travelling with a timetable and a ticket that gives you a right to a seat on this train and so on. And I really had I had no bad experiences hitchhiking. And in my mid-20s, when I was writing for the Pick Me Up email zine that Charlie Davies and a couple of others started, I started writing an article that was, 10 things I learnt from hitchhiking. Halfway through writing that article, I was thumbing a lift from Sheffield down the M1, and I got into the back of a van with these 3 guys in the front. And I quickly realised this was the vibe was not good, Ed. I'd sat in courtrooms listening to the retelling of stories that end badly. And I could see enough in the way these 3 guys were joking with each other and in my vulnerability as the stranger in the back of the van that reminded me of that I thought this is not a good scene. And luckily the traffic was held up and I was able to say my goodbyes and get out and walk along the hard shoulder to the nearest petrol station. But without knowing who is on the other end of the line, I was willing to take that as a message from ... to say maybe not a good idea to write this article that's encouraging people you don't know to go out and put themselves in the position of vulnerability and danger of going out hitchhiking. Maybe people need to make that decision for themselves without reading an enthusiastic, encouraging all the amazing things that happened to me because of my adventures while hitchhiking story by Dougald. And I think that was probably a wise... That was the sagacity being applied to the accident of that.
And touching on a bit of zemblanity.
Bit of zemblanity, maybe, yes. So, yeah. But, all this stuff we've been talking about just now brings me back to the book that you told me that you'd read after our last episode. That I can see you... This is like... We don't get to do this when we're sat on Zoom. I can see you sitting there with a beautiful copy of it in front of you, Ed. Do you want to tell us about this book?
Yeah, well, regular listeners will obviously be familiar with the fact that we seem to plough through a gargantuan amount of reading material. But yeah, there was something you said, making reference to Gordon White's Rune Soup podcast on several occasions over the different series. And I have to confess, I hadn't actually dipped into his work, perhaps in a deep enough fashion. And then when you made reference to his new book, Animistic, Encounters with the Living Cosmos, there was something about it that just, it really sparked with me, really chimed. And so I tracked down a copy, a rather expensive, beautifully made hardback copy, which I got from an esoteric bookshop in Glastonbury, of course. And this tome arrived, and I was actually immediately slightly intimidated. As oh my god, it is presented like something.
It's an object.
It's an object. It's beautiful and magical. Has a gorgeous illustration on the cover and a proper heft to it. And I started reading it, and I was absolutely gripped. And as I say, I'm a fairly prolific and voracious reader. I'm also probably a slightly world-weary reader on occasion. If I'm reading something, go, oh yes, I love that. That's a nice articulation. But to be sideswiped by a book is an uncommon experience. And Gordon's book totally sideswiped me. The opening couple of chapters where he sort of challenges this materialist, naturalist kind of frame we have on everything, where empiricism is the be-all and end-all, and anything we might intuitively feel beyond that, that can't be properly measured, is therefore dismissed. And what really got me was this, the sort of magic of encounter. And we've talked about Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, and Martin Shaw often references the kind of fact we've fallen out of a love tangle with the planet, and Gordon's chapters just unfold through these magical encounters with this living, throbbing, strumming cosmos around us. And one of the reasons I think it resonated so much is because that's what I feel when I set out here on this deck. Hopefully, as you said, you're getting a bit of a flavour of it now, because you're totally here, and you're totally here immersed in it, and it is interactive. It's not a passive Instagram experience. It's definitely being intricately interwoven with all the stuff that's just going on and grooving and doing its thing. So the butterflies over there and these blue flowers, which I don't actually remember from last season, but which are lining the waterway, and then you've got your Himalayan balsam there, which is as Gordon would say, an invasive species. What the hell does that mean in some ways? Surely it's just a new arrival, and it may disrupt some of the conventional static ecology that we might want to think of in the terms of conservation, but hey, everyone else seems to be living quite happily alongside the balsam there. I don't get the impression that the balsam is particularly upsetting the other flora and fauna around it. But yeah, I just absolutely loved the book and devoured it, and it's quite a big tome in about 2 or 3 days. And I think I said to you is that I don't think I'll ever see the world in quite the same way again, which is a hell of a tribute to give to a book. And it really left me with this sense. There's always that Native American perspective, isn't there, that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass, but all my relations, and after reading Animistic, I felt like I'd had a kind of a literary encounter with all my relations.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I second all of this. It's an extraordinary book, and
it's also a playful book. I think the other thing I loved about Gordon's writing is it's a little bit arch. Every now and again there's a raised eyebrow or sort of sardonic or sarcastic comment.
Just a little.
Yeah. But also it's the sense of fun that comes through when he goes, well, this could be true, or this could be true. And actually, wouldn't it be so much more joyful if you chose to believe this particular frame, where we haven't got a kind of, a fundamentally rigorous way of evaluating the pros and cons of the different perspectives, but boy, this one is wonderful.
Yeah. No, well, he's very good at going, well, I can give you enough evidence to unsettle the things that you're meant to take as given. As good, well-behaved, modern Western minds. I can give you enough evidence that works even by the criteria that you're meant to be assessing things by, enough scientific evidence to unsettle lots of what we're meant to take as given about the world. And then here's the invitation to an adventure of another way of inhabiting the world. And one of the key things that, because you're right, it's a book that really is kind of jamming with Robin Wall Kimmerer and Bayo Akomolafe and Tyson Yunkaporta and Vanessa Andreotti and a lot of the indigenous thinkers who've been really important to our conversations. It also feels like the sort of next generation from David Abrams' work. I had this sense this spring reading Animistic and James Bridle's Ways of Being. Both of those are books that expressly invoke Dave's phrase about the more than human world. And it feels like this is kind of our generation, the next generation of thinkers coming along and taking that and going further into the adventure that David's work invites us to. And one of the ways that Gordon frames this is, say, modernity, as we usually call it around here. Modernity invites us to treat the world as a made thing, a mechanism, a piece of clockwork, something that was made and then there it is. The alternative invitation is to treat the world as something that's an ongoing process. It's like the making is never finished.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that rang really loud and clear for me from reading the book, like how different it is to inhabit the world one of those ways to the other. The possibility of the world as a thing, as full of encounters, is there if it and it resonates across to the John Berger quote that I always come back to about the making. The making of reality is never finished. Something is always in the balance. Reality is always in need, even of us, damned and marginal as we may be. And then, a couple of weeks after finishing Animistic, and this picks up on the theme of last episode when we were talking about belief, I was listening to Paul Kingsnorth in conversation with Rowan Williams.
Wow.
Which, it was actually really very lovely to listen to. And Paul was very kind of shy and modest about being asked to talk about theology with this great theologian, former Archbishop of Canterbury.
No pressure.
Yeah. And Rowan was as humble and, lovely a human being as he always is. And he said at a point, Christianity rightly understood has a story of creation as something that is always ongoing, not the world as something that God made and then, set running and walked away from. That's the deist alternative theology that was kind of conjured up around the end of the 17th century. But, whatever else you want to say about Christianity and its theology and traditions, it can actually, you can get to the same position that Gordon is describing as a chaos magician of, inhabiting the world as a living cosmos rather than a dead piece of clockwork. You can get there from straight Orthodox Christian theology if that's the ticket you're travelling on. I could go on about Animistic all day. Clearly, I think you could as well. But it's really it's a special book.
Exactly, and I think we often talk about the things we've been reading, don't we? And I think it was worth sharing, some expansive thoughts on that, simply because it is one of those sort of powerful ones that will linger in the memory for a long time. But I mean, what's next on your reading list? What are you kind of planning on?
Well, I've got a host of weird books that I picked up in London on this trip. The rucksack weighs about twice as much going back as it did coming out. I just started the Reverend Danny Nemo's Neuro Apocalypse, and Danny Nemo is somebody, I don't know what kind of reverend he is, not the same kind as Rowan Williams, I don't think. But he's somebody I picked up via Gordon's podcast, you see. And I only read the first chapter or two of that, but there's a lovely bit in that about his experiences of moving to Japan and learning Japanese and working in a Japanese context. And he talks about this word ki in Japanese that's used in lots of phrases. There are lots of things that you can't express without referring to ki. And he says, if you try and translate it into English, you get something like energy or vibes or chi. So chi and ki are etymologically the same concept, but you can't do it in English without it having these kind of spiritual, religious, alternative, new agey vibes. And he says what's extraordinary about inhabiting the world with Japanese as the language you're working with is there are just so many everyday things or ordinary things that you can't say without invoking this concept of ki because it's so central. To say I'm interested in something, or to say we don't get on with each other, or to say something got my attention, or to say I've got an erection. Like all of those things, the phrases by which you say them invoke this concept of ki. And so it's kind of there, not as without a load of baggage or a load of excess weight put on it, but just as a matter of fact part of how you inhabit the world if you're starting from a language like Japanese. And it just felt like a really good example of, the different places we're starting from, and therefore maybe a clue to what it might look like to deal pragmatically with the idea that reality is stranger than our way of thinking that we were born into around here lately allows for, without that having to go to some woo-woo space in order to do it. So I'm looking forward to reading the rest of Neuro Apocalypse.
I mean, because again, without sort of going back to Gordon White too much, but there's a sort of satisfying discomfort that comes from that acknowledgement that your perception of reality might only be a fragment of the bigger picture that is vibrating along out there, and that you've only got that little narrow pinhole camera view of everything that's actually going on.
Well, that seems like a fairly basic definition of humbling and like taking a humbler approach to reality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So what else are you reading at the moment, Ed?
Well, the other one that, it's not disconnected in a way. The other one, which I'm about halfway through, is one that was actually recommended by my fellow futurenaut, Mark Stevenson, because we're doing a bit of work on the future of food right now. And Mark is incredibly selective in the books he reads. Largely because he thinks he knows everything. And I say that with love. But, so for him to make a book recommendation is like, oh, okay, you should sit up and listen to this. And also, and I mean this with all respect as well, he's quite an empiricist. So, but he said, have you read James Rebank's English Pastoral? And I said, no. And he was like, you have got to read this book. So I bought it, and I'm about halfway through, and it's just this magically beautiful encapsulation of how the last sort of 50 or 60 years of agricultural practice in the UK in particular, and focused on his two Lake District family farms, has changed, and how this whole shift has gone on through the generations. And it starts off with him very much being brought into farming through his love and respect for his grandfather, and the practices of the land, and the very sort of deep human connection to this very vulnerable thin topsoil of the fells, with the bedrock underneath, and the very fact that he'd each field had its own individual name and personality and characteristics, and needed to be tended and loved and nurtured in a different way, depending on rainfall and aspect, and what stream passed through it, the hedgerows, what grazing and what crops would be planted. And the sense you get from Rebanks, and he's structured the book in, and that's the sheepdog next door.
Yeah, there we go.
That's Jack the sheepdog. I have to say,
sheepdog solo.
Yeah, as Jack's neighbour, I'm slightly less tolerant of Jack these days. But it's obviously quite apt when we're talking about fell farms and sheep as well. But the way that James Rebanks structures the book is, around this past, present and future, which he calls nostalgia, present and then utopia. And I'm about halfway through the middle chapter on the present. And it seems that the way that he's framing this is in the fact that his granddad had, this very deep connection with the land. His father nearly put him off farming because his father was caught in this progressive modernity, where it felt like an arms race of productivity and intensification and machinery and all of these things that were dramatically enhancing the efficiency of the lowland farms in the valley. They were increasing their output, which was making the competition much more intense, and through an economic lens, their farm really struggling because they could never find the finance or the capital to transform it. And him, as the sort of the third generation of this cycle, then going, actually, in many ways, Grandad was right. And whilst we have struggled with these forces of modernity, we kind of need to go back to where my grandfather was and his intimacy of connection with that soul of the soil that so many other authors have written so beautifully about. And as I haven't finished the book, but again, it's a bit like Gordon White. It's incredibly gripping because it's told through this very deeply personal story of one family on two small farms in one little corner of marginal hillside England, and yet it represents so much of these mega forces and trends and cycles that are going on worldwide.
Yeah, I haven't read this yet. I read James Rebanks' first book, A Shepherd's Life, and I really loved it, especially the opening chapter, which was a remarkable sort of essay on education, where he's talking about the sort of alienation between him and his fellow pupils at this comprehensive school in Cumbria and the teachers who are kind of trying to, these are kids from farming families who don't necessarily have any good relationship to what is being offered to them by an education system whose basic premise is, if you've got any wits about you, you want to get out of here. There is no respect for the possibility that there might be anything worth doing or any relationship worth having in the relationship to land coming from these university-educated teachers. And so there is a kind of low-level and sometimes more than low-level kind of thuggery of the reaction coming back from a lot of the kids that Rebanks is pretty clear that he was part of. And he describes this one lesson where this teacher is trying to tell them about the Romantic poets who came to Cumbria and wrote these beautiful poems responding to the landscape. He's like, well, but this is the landscape that my family farms, and that you want us to, work hard and get our exams so that we don't have to do anything as low status as carry on farming this land that you're simultaneously romanticising. And I suppose that led me to there's a Substack written by an anonymous author who's an NHS worker in Yorkshire called Flat Caps and Fatalism.
I just love that as a title.
Great title. There's a lot to digest in it, and we'll probably come back and talk about it another time. It was via Paul Kingsnorth that I found my way to it. But the most recent essay on there, it's a short piece called The Dishonest Land, and it's very much in the vein of Paul's writing or somebody like D.H. Lawrence. I just wanted to read you a little bit of this. I mean, the whole thing is prompted by him visiting, or her, I don't know, visiting Manchester for the first time in a few years and seeing these horrific kind of skyscrapers that have been built there, but seeing them as, in some sense, the most honest thing in this whole landscape of northern England. And so they write, "The cities lie. Their radical chic is stretched tight over the bare lust for money. Their cosmopolitan diversity hides the uniformity of clawing ambition. Their youth is stolen from elsewhere, used for a time and discarded when its looks and gullibility begin to fade. They grow little food and make fewer objects every year. They offer only services no one needs and knowledge no one believes. The countryside lies. The fertilised fields barely pay the bills, but 5 families worked this land before it was improved. The tasteful barn conversions shelter dreamers who touch the soil with their eyes alone. The very lambs in the fields deceive. They tell you that this place feeds others, but it has long taken more than it gives. It is hungry, always hungry, hungry for oil and hungry for money. The countryside is the skin of the land, but its glow is not healthy. It is sunburn. The energy poured into it has killed it, and soon it will peel away from the flesh below." And there's sort of a dark sublime in this writing, and a kind of, somebody on our long table call the other day spoke about widening the aperture of awareness. And it's easy when we talk about that, or Vanessa Andreotti talks about when people do recognise the root level disconnection, the kind of myth of separation as somewhere deep at the heart of how we got to the fix that we're in. People's first reaction is a desire for a kind of shiny, sparkling reconnection to the living world, to the more than human world. But I remember when I had the conversation with David Abraham for Dark Mountain years and years ago, he said, it's a shadowed world. Like to widen the aperture of awareness today, if we're being honest, is to widen it to let in all of the horror show of the way we're actually inhabiting the world, and not just to get some kind of Disney magic reconnection to the living cosmos. There's a lot of shadow in the magic of what we're.
Well, that's an echo of Aldo Leopold, isn't it? To be an ecologist is to live in a world of wounds. Yeah. Because once you fully understand that weft of life and the harrowing sort of journey it's been on, largely at our mercy, that you then appreciate the fact that what you see is those wounds and those shadows, not just, as you say, the Disneyfication or the magic. And I think when you see exemplars of those little islands of possibility, when you were reading that sort of Dishonest Land piece, I was thinking of another farm down the road from here, which I don't see my Norfolk landscape of my roots through the same eyes that I saw it as a teenager. And coming back after 30 years away, I suddenly see this as the sort of monocultural crop-based concentration camp that it is, where you've got these vast seas of relatively barren desert, which is also, the grain bowl of England. And then you see the kind of contrast to somewhere like Wakelins, which is an agroforestry project on 50 acres of former arable land. And it's like this island bounty of fecundity and diversity, mature trees, interstitial crops planted in between, a buzz with birds and insects. It's all of that magical possibility of what the landscape could look like if we approached and engaged with it as an encounter with a living cosmos, and joined the team, rather than flogging it like some kind of colonial slave driver with a whip, to get the produce out of the land. And then that's when you see it. And I think, for me, where our conversation has gone today, as we said, nice to meet you, it's about meeting all these things, if you like, afresh for the first time. Whether it's the people, us meeting together, throwing people together at a party, meeting places for the first time, meeting the very notion of progress and modernity, eyes open for the first time, but also that magical possibility of what could be.
And places are waiting to meet us if we open our eyes and slow down and give them our attention. What they have to say to us may not be comfortable to hear. I was on this call with Tyson Juncker-Porter a while back. It was me and Felix Marquardt and Tyson, and it was the first time that the three of us had spoken together. And so there's me and Felix, these two kind of privileged white European guys, and Tyson is this grumpy Aboriginal Australian, brilliant, amazing man, thinker. And he said this thing just as an aside, almost muttered under his breath. At one point in the call, he said, "You guys getting bored of all that stuff yet?" And the next day I was on a call with a couple of other European friends, and one of them was talking about, going out onto the land and getting a message from the land. And I thought, I would trust the messages people tell me that they get from listening to the land a bit more if I heard that the land had spoken to them and it had said in a kind of grumpy voice, "You guys getting bored of all that stuff yet?" Like maybe that's the precondition for re-entering relationship, but the cost is incalculable. It's starting from here, and that's where the truth in that kind of dark vision of the flat caps and fatalism piece comes from for me. But we don't have a choice, because that's where we are headed anyway, further into this encounter, and we stumble into it like blindly or opening our eyes and blinking at the harsh light of it, and somewhere within there, it's back to the Berger thing. It's not settled. Something is always in the balance. Reality is always in need, even of us. And the thought that came to me last night when we were sat around in your kitchen and you were talking about the James Rebanks book and his thing of the three generations of his grandfather and then his father. And I thought, for how many people in this world is that actually true? That the whole journey into modernity and then into its coming out the far side of it in one way or another is held within an arc that is within living memory. I remember my friend Jadra, who I met years ago when I was traveling in Kazakhstan, who, she was a doctor working for the World Health Organization. Her parents were good Soviet-era rationalists. Her grandmother still lived half the year in a yurt on the steppe, and her great-grandfather had been a traditional healer of great reputation within Kazakh culture. And I remember in that encounter and in our conversations over a week or so in Almaty, just a recognition of my own poverty, like how much further back I had to reach, how much farther out of memory any experience of being in place and standing in tradition culturally was. And just that was a kind of flickering dawning of awareness that maybe the protagonists of whatever happens as we roll further through the unraveling that's around and ahead of us, maybe the protagonists are not the people who look like you and me, Ed, and expect to be the protagonists of change and change makers and the ones who live closest to the future, the world's most modern people. Maybe the protagonists, in the best case, are the people who are only a generation or two away from ways of living in the world that might have a chance of being viable on the far side of this oil-fueled madness that we were born into the heart of.
Thank you for listening to The Great Humbling. If you'd like to follow the threads in our conversations further, head over to homewardbound.org, where you'll also find my Substack, Writing Home. You'll find us on Facebook as The Great Humbling, and Ed is at FruCool on Twitter. We're always glad to hear from those of you who are listening, and we're deeply grateful for all that our listeners do to spread the word and bring these conversations to new ears by sharing the podcast along your networks and giving it ratings or reviews on the platforms where you listen. These are strange and humbling times, and we need quiet corners, breathing spaces, air pockets and pockets of resistance, places in which to puzzle through how we got here and where we might be going. Thank you for helping us create one of those pockets.